Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are in the world, and welcome to today's DevOps.com program, brought to you by Techstrong and Nirmata. My name is Cody J. Brown. I'm the host of Techstrong Learning, and we have an exciting panel ahead. First, I do have just a couple of housekeeping notes to cover. So today's session is being recorded. If you miss any of our discussion, or maybe you'd like to rewatch or share with a friend, the on-demand recording will be made available shortly after we conclude our live session today. If you have any questions, and we really hope you do, we want you to send those in to us using the Q&A tab. You'll find that tab on the right side of the screen, and we plan on addressing as many questions as we can toward the end of the program. So be sure to send your question in early. If you look on the right side of the screen, you'll also find the chat tab, and that's where we want you to get to know your fellow audience members. Let us know your thoughts throughout today's program, or maybe just from where you're tuning in. And of course, before we close out, we are giving away 4 $25 Amazon gift cards. So be sure to stick around for the duration of today's program. So on to our topic, top Kubernetes security concerns and how to address them. I'm joined by Jim Bugwadia, founder and CEO of Nirmata, Chip Zoller, technical product manager at Nirmata, Mitch Ashley, CTO here at Techstrong Group and principal of Techstrong Research. So thank you to Jim, Chip, and Mitch. Mitch, do you want to get us started from here?
Yeah, happy to. Thank you so much, Cody. Always fun doing these with you and the Nirmata team. As Cody mentioned, I'm CTO at Techstrong Group, also serves as analyst, founder of our analyst business, focused on security, cloud native, DevOps, digital transformation. And one of the things that we do in our research is we do kind of full-blown projects. We also leverage the fact that we have a really big audience through DevOps.com and Container Journal and Techstrong TV and SecurityBoulevard.com. So we have very large readership and followers, and they're very happy to share with us, how they feel about certain topics. And Kubernetes and security is definitely one of them. So we've pulled together some of our research information into this document, and I think we're going to be providing that as something as a follow-up. After the webinar here today. But I want to share with you some of the highlights from that. It's not a long document. It's mostly graphs and data to give you an idea of kind of how folks are looking at security in Kubernetes. Looking at what are your top security concerns around Kubernetes. Not too surprising, misconfiguration, runtime, threat, incident management. We deal with those in all areas. So that's true, of course, in Kubernetes world. But follow that up with things like pod security policy management is a big topic with folks. And given the complexity of Kubernetes, and then you add security on top of that. And I've been working with Kubernetes since, I guess, 2017. So it's evolved a lot, but it's still a chore to properly secure it, make sure you're keeping up with changes in your environment that are happening quite frequently. So I'm sure we'll be getting into some of these topics as we move into other parts of the webinar. Talking about Kate's security issues, only a third are taking a proactive action. In other words, where are you about security? You're just kind of like, it's there. We got to do something about it, but we're too busy to get after it yet. Are we being proactive? And we've got projects underway. So a good, healthy third of the respondents to our polls said that they are active in it. They either have it as a funded project or something right on the heels of the turn of the year into 2023. And another third, or a little bit over, are handling it on a project by project basis. Very common approach as you start to formalize things and take them to the next level. And of course, there's folks that are still kind of grappling and not sure where they are to get started yet. So we have some growing and maturing to do in security. Policy management, I mentioned earlier, is one of the big concerns around security. What are the approaches that people are taking? Not surprisingly, open source is a fairly good size of it, along with Kubernetes-native pod security policies, the capabilities that are inherent within Kube. And of course, commercial products, cloud service provider. Some don't have a solution yet. I guess if you're not working on it, you probably don't fall into one of the other camps. So I think the good thing about this is, we all rely heavily on open source and supporters of it, and I know the Nirmata folks are as well. But we really mix that with commercial products, cloud service provider offerings, and usually it's some combination of those, open source with some other types of product or service that folks usually depend on. So I think as we get into the Nirmata portion, I'm excited to hear about some of the information they have to share with us. One of the I think important things to recognize is, well, we typically adopt a new technology, it could be Kubernetes or something else. Sort of security often follows it, right? We don't think about security and layering all that in and designing that in and take care of it up front. We're excited about what we can do with a technology like container orchestration and managing very large applications, microservices, cloud native based with something like Kubernetes. So the wave behind it tends to be security. And that's very much what we're seeing here, but it hasn't slowed adoption of Kubernetes, and not surprising. I think we all know it's being widely adopted, and if not increasingly so. But security is on the radar for folks, and they are concerned about it. But at the same time, they're moving forward. So I guess that's good news for all of us, because we're getting the advances and advantages of Kubernetes, as well as taking security seriously with it too. So there are a lot of other good information. It's a 2-page report. It's not heavy in text. It won't take you long to read it. But there are some things I didn't have time to share with you today. I think are worthwhile taking a look at that. So we'll make sure that everybody attending today has a chance to do that. So Jim, happy to turn it over to you.
Thank you, Mitch, and thanks everyone for joining. I'm Jim Bugwadia, co-founder, CEO at Nirmata. I am also a maintainer of Kyverno, and in the Kubernetes community, I'm a co-chair in the policy and multi-tenancy working group. Um, so what I want to kind of talk about is how Kubernetes impacts, both agility and security. And one interesting, kind of at least realization for me in my Kubernetes journey was there are technologies, there are tools being evolved in the community which help us drive towards both. Um, so to start with, I want to share some. This was research done by the 451 group, a study that they published a couple of years ago as they, looked at various organizations and successful transformation, successful adoption of DevOps and other best practices in that. And they highlighted three things which were very interesting to me. The first is, of course, transformation involves driving towards agility. As businesses, as organizations, we all want to move faster. We all want to deliver greater value to our customers, our end users. But to get to that agility, there needs to be a fair amount of autonomy across teams, across groups. We've all kind of heard of, even larger organizations, the famous, two pizza box rule, where you want small teams that can move independently, move fast, make decisions, and get things done. But of course, we all also know that to deliver this, there needs to be alignment, right? So that's where you need governance, you need policy to come in. So the study, in a very what I found a very exciting and nice way, presented that for successful transformation, agility, of course, is the driver. That's the end goal, but that requires autonomy as well as alignment. And to me, that relates very well to Kubernetes. So if you think about it, Kubernetes is the first platform that's been so as widely adopted in IT and in the technology space, which was built for multiple teams to collaborate and to do their work together. It was built for DevSecOps, and this is as a best practice, driving alignment across developers who are deploying applications to Kubernetes, operations teams who are responsible for the platforms, the clusters themselves, and then the security teams who are looking at organizational security at a high level, but then other things like vulnerability management, incident management, runtime, all of those concerns need to come together. And Kubernetes, it's one of the value propositions of it is that it's the first platform that allows us to codify these concerns and really embrace this approach of these different teams collaborating on that shared goal. So just to kind of dive in a little bit deeper to that, to one aspect of Kubernetes which stands out is its configuration management system. And configuration management, of course, as we know, in any IT domain or any industry domain, is how you would provision, how you tell the system what to do. And typically, there are two styles of instructions that you could have. You could have a declarative style, which is you're more representing the end goals of where you want to be, and then the system figures out what to do. Or you could have an imperative style where you're instructing the system step by step of what to do next. Kubernetes is a declarative, system. You tell Kubernetes what you want, and it has controllers, some of which are built in, others could be extensions, which will go off and do that work on your behalf to make the current state match with the desired state that you described in your configuration. In Kubernetes, these configurations are captured typically as YAML files, which specify exactly the details, the desired state in a lot of detail of the resources that you want. And then Kubernetes controllers or custom controllers you can install can perform that work on your behalf. So the interesting thing here is Kubernetes from the beginning was also designed to be extensible. So not only can it do things like, of course, scheduling pods on the best available resources, or things like bringing up workloads, allocating capacity, but you can extend Kubernetes in other areas as well. And we'll take a look at how the tools like we'll talk about in the policy area take advantage of that to provide a lot of good functionality for DevSecOps teams. So one thing, like Mitch mentioned, which we often hear is Kubernetes is complex, right? And in many ways, rightly so, because it solves a set of very complex problems. But there's also, by design, Kubernetes was, built to be able to address, concerns for several different roles, like we talked about, different teams, developers, security admins, operations teams, teams deploying shared services which might be consumed by other teams. So all of these need to come together to deliver value, to deliver tools and services to their customers. And Kubernetes by design is non-opinionated, right? So it has a set of constructs. You can really think of it as a toolbox, and it's up to you what you build, how you kind of leverage Kubernetes. And one of the things which might be surprising to folks is it's not, again, given that non-opinionated nature, it's not secure by default. You have to configure certain things to make Kubernetes secure. But if you just run vanilla Kubernetes, or even if you consume a managed Kubernetes service, they are not secure by default. Other things have to be installed to enable that security. And we'll take a look at some of the key use cases there and how that can be done. But the other thing, that we saw also in the survey results, which is very common, misconfigurations by far. So combining these factors, the very detailed declarative configuration management, which drives the control loops, the fact that there's different roles, coordinating configuration, and the fact that Kubernetes kind of leaves it up to you on how you want to design your platforms and services, um, make misconfigurations common and make them the leading cause of issues within Kubernetes itself. So this is where we believe that policies, and not just policies, but I'll talk about how policies can be made very native to Kubernetes, are the right way to solve these problems. So if you think about it, policies themselves act as a contract, right? I mean, of course, in real life, you could have a policy as a document. In the context of Kubernetes, policies are a digital contract, right? They are expressed, somewhere in a Git repository or in some system of record, which can then be shared as a contract between roles, developers, security, and operations. Policies can directly be built, and we'll see examples of this, to prevent misconfigurations. But more importantly, policies can also help automate several security concerns. So one of the, again, realizations was with this fine-grained configuration management that's required in Kubernetes, it's important to automate security itself, and to make sure that there's self-service, the autonomy across those roles, but there's proper security, proper guardrails in place at every step of the process. So going to Kubernetes native policies. So if we understand the value of policies in general, what does it mean for a policy tool or for a policy to be native to Kubernetes? So first off, leveraging Kubernetes configuration management, like I mentioned, it's designed to be extensible. So why not leverage that itself to declare your policies? And why not leverage the same control loop and the same patterns that Kubernetes uses for pod scheduling, for other things, for policy management? So leveraging that Kubernetes custom resource definition capabilities, making sure that policies can work well with other Kubernetes tools, whether it's GitOps controllers, whether it's things like kubectl, Kustomize, other tools that we use for Kubernetes. All of these should work well with policies, and then also being plugged in into the internals of how Kubernetes works to be able to optimize policy decisions is very important. Like every resource in Kubernetes has schema for the policy engine to be able to look up that schema, to be able to provide proper feedback to both developers, operators, security teams, and again optimized for decisions is very important. So finally, one thing to think about is Kubernetes is no longer just for scheduling pods or running workloads. And what the trend that we are starting to see is cloud native and Kubernetes are transforming every aspect of IT operations, every aspect of how we do work, around the context, of course, of system delivery, system management, etc. So really, the thing that's happening in very record time is Git is moving. We all talk about shift left. We all talk about, everything as code, like policy as code or infrastructure as code. But really what that means is adopting best practices of software delivery, of software management, and applying it to these other processes. So here, Git version control becomes your system of record instead of approvals in a ticketing system or approvals in some other third party tool. Why not use these same tools that developers and other teams are familiar with to capture those? Kubernetes then becomes your system of engagement, even for ordering things like infrastructure, whether it's ordering a new cluster, a new namespace, new cloud resources. That becomes the where that engagement occurs. And but to make this successful, Kubernetes native policies, we believe, are required and are a must have to drive that agility, but with autonomy and alignment across your DevSecOps teams. So, with that, let me hand off to Chip, who's going to go into details about how this can actually work in your Kubernetes clusters.
Thank you, Jim. Hey, everybody. My name is Chip Zoller. I'm a technical product manager here at Nirmata. I'm also a Kyverno maintainer, which I'll talk about, and pretty active in the Kyverno community and the larger Kubernetes community, working and very interested in the technology, but also the problems from a real world perspective and how we can go about solving those in the best way. So as Jim talked about, one of the things that we need in order to attain the state is this concept of a Kubernetes native policy. That is something that we're all familiar with, that allows recycling of existing knowledge and techniques. And one of the things that we at Nirmata created some time ago is this project called Kyverno, which we created internally and then spun it out as an open source project. It's since been donated to the CNCF. It's gained incredible popularity, and now we find that it's in the incubating state. So Kyverno is the technology that we can use to enact these policies that give us this, that allow to solve for these use cases, and also many other things that cross-cut through these disciplines. So Kyverno means govern in Greek, and you can see the actual Greek that's right there. Kyverno has the ability to do several different things that allow us to move towards this world of not only converging everything into the Kubernetes control plane, but also getting that policy as Kubernetes native resources. the first and foremost thing that almost everyone thinks of when they talk about policy or when they think of policy is validation. That is to deliver a yes or no response as triggered by some sort of resource. Kyverno has the ability to do this quite elegantly, as you'll see. Another fairly common use case that Kyverno can accomplish is mutating resources. That is, submitting one resource and tacitly changing that resource based upon your desires. All of this codified as policy. It can do that. And generating or creating new resources. So a new resource comes in, or maybe it's an action against one. You want to do things like create a new resource quota, for example. This is a capability that really no other policy engines have, and allows movement across teams into operations. So typically in policy, the idea is that this is predominantly a tool for security, predominantly a tool for operators. But in the generate use case, this is actually something that can be used to accomplish automation tasks, and that can augment some of these other capabilities. And also, Kyverno has the ability to verify container images as part of your software supply chain security. So the ability for it to introspect images and ensure that they're either signed, or if you have attestations, Kyverno can accomplish all of these things in a singular tool using policy as native Kubernetes constructs that does not involve code. And we'll get into more of this. Also, it has the ability to create reports so that you can get feedback with your security teams. You can work with your security teams to understand the disposition of your cluster and the resources that are in that. How am I doing? How compliant am I? Is something passing or failing? What's the reason for that? This can be created and viewed fairly simply within the cluster. And also, Kyverno offers a CLI that can run in a CI/CD pipeline so that you can know ahead of time in your resource promotion process, do these resources, do these qualify, or these pass these policies? And Kyverno runs as an admission controller inside Kubernetes. So this is one of the primary methods by which Kubernetes can be extended. And Kyverno does this for us inside of a Kubernetes cluster. So quickly, some of the use cases that Kyverno solves for, and I talked a little bit about these, but number one, and as you saw when Mitch presented the slides, pod security is top of mind. Kyverno does this very simply. These would be examples of validate rules. This pod's coming in. Do we want to allow it or not? This is one of the most basic things that everyone is thinking of solving for and should be trying to solve for. But also workload security and best practices, which may go hand in hand with pod security, but oftentimes they don't. And so one of the things that we should keep in mind is that, you know, a pod is one resource type inside of Kubernetes. I think out of the box and by default with no other extensions, there's somewhere in the neighborhood of around 80 to 90 resources total. Pods are just one. So workload security has to encompass all of those things. What about services that get created? What about ingresses that get created? What about all of these other resources? And that's before we even start talking about custom resources. But best practices as well. There are cross-cutting concerns there that pertain to security, pertain to governance. So Kyverno solves these quite well. Fine-grained RBAC. In Kubernetes, there's only so far that you can go as far as role-based access control. Kyverno and tools like it can extend this even further by applying much more fine-grained control, even down to things like resource names or name patterns, roles, usernames, a variety of conditions. Things like cost control, and this is an example of governance. Not allowing load balancers to be spun up in a cloud environment, or multiple of them, or any X number of them that would quickly overwhelm budgets. Not going to drain all of these things, but you can see they're quite vast here. Multi-tenancy. This is a very common one where namespaces should be provisioned and things should be deployed into them, and also operations automation. So a lot of different capabilities that Kyverno solves for here, and I'll touch on this in some of these in just a moment here. So you have some choices of what to use, but why is it that Kyverno should be something that you might want to consider looking at to solve for some of these? Well, as Jim mentioned, it's Kubernetes native. The you're able to recycle the skills and the tools that you have today to work with it. All of the policies are expressed as YAML. There's no programming language that's required, which is the second point there. And this is probably the most popular point why so many people are turning to Kyverno. Not only is there no programming knowledge required, there's no programming enacted that's required here. So you don't need to write a programming language to get these desires accomplished. It's all done with Kubernetes idioms with which you're already familiar. And as a result of this, policy is super easy and writable and understandable by everyone, not just the few that have programming skills and they have the tools to do that, but it's easily written by anyone by virtue of you already writing resources to go into Kubernetes for things like building an entire cluster, requesting a certificate, obviously creating pods, or even some esoteric things like maybe creating a new user in an Active Directory or ordering pizza. Policy can also be understood by everyone because it uses these same idioms. You can clearly see in its definition what it's doing, what it's supposed to do without having to decipher programming. And that's fairly powerful. It's also one of the fastest growing CNCF projects out there. As I mentioned, it's currently in incubating state, eyeing towards graduation, and we're seeing tremendous adoption in the community. It's slowly becoming the de facto standard for applying policy in Kubernetes. And as a kind of a proof point of that, you can see that it's the most starred Kubernetes policy engine out there. Kyverno is becoming super popular, and as a result, you see the star count over there on the right. Talked about some of the different capabilities, but several of these are unique, namely the generate capability, the ability for you to create new resources that solve use cases and not just simply reject them if they don't conform to existing patterns. But importantly, it allows you to reuse your existing tools. You have tool sets today to work with YAML, Git, Customize. There are a lot of other tools that you're using out there. Owing to the fact that there's not just a block that you dump programming into, you can use those existing tools and your skill sets to work with these same resources. Reports are also decoupled from the policies, which is important when allowing teams like security to get involved, because now you can separate who writes policies and who can see the result of those policies. And that's incredibly powerful. And I'll show a way that you can actually visualize that here. But it allows testing in CI/CD pipelines through the CLI that it offers, which is essential today to know that the resources that your developers and other teams are working on, long before they hit a cluster and are either summarily rejected or changed in some way, you can know about how they're going to react in a live environment and know if they need to make changes there. Another great benefit is the policy library. It's the largest policy library of any engine for Kubernetes. I think we have close to 200, and shortly that'll be over 200. And these are policies that are not just for Kubernetes itself, as far as core Kubernetes resources, but are for a number of different major ecosystem programs out there. So Argo, Cert Manager, service meshes, there's all sorts of things that Kyverno policy can be written for. And indeed, we have examples of those and a lot of others. And all of these are written and contributed by community members or contributors and are designed to solve real live use cases, not hello world, not contrived use cases. So looking a little bit more as far as the operation, I talked about how Kyverno was an admission controller, but if we kind of see that in the context of the Kubernetes cluster, Kyverno is going to receive these things called admission review requests. And so anytime that you create a resource or you update a resource or delete a resource, the API server, by virtue of a webhook that it will have, will instruct it to send these things down to Kyverno. And in response to those admission reviews, which wrap these objects in which you're interested, Kyverno will take action based upon the policies that you've created. And so if you have validate policies, Kyverno will validate those admission review requests based on the policy definition. So you define what your intent is, and I'll show an example of a couple of those intents. And Kyverno will respond back to the API server in the case of validate rules and say, yes, it's allowed, no, it's not. But these other use cases, mutation generation, based upon those same admission review requests, Kyverno will react and either change the resource or generate new resources. And as a result of all of those capabilities, it'll generate things like events, we'll get policy violations, and we'll get new resources. So Kyverno is designed to be run inside of a Kubernetes cluster that interfaces with the API server through webhooks, is an admission controller, and has the capability to validate, mutate, generate, and secure software supply chain all through one entity, not bolt-on, no attached functionality. It's all built in. There's nothing that you need to do to unlock these. It's simply a matter of you installing a policy. And as I mentioned, about 200 of those and soon more can be downloaded and used right now, including the full suite of pod security standards. And so they can be quickly leveraged for very quick time to value. So let's dive in and look at a brief example of this. So I talked about validate capabilities, and Jim talked about native Kubernetes resources and how important that is. Well, this is an actual example of a Kubernetes policy, and one that solves a security use case, which is very common among pod use cases, and that is to prevent privilege escalation. Very rarely should you ever allow privilege escalation for a container. And I'm willing to bet that most of you, if you haven't seen a Kyverno policy before, you can probably look at this policy and understand what this does. And so very quickly, by looking at the pattern section, we can just see that it's looking underneath containers and making sure that allow privilege escalation field is set to false. This is going to look for any and every pod, and this is going to make sure that it's set to false. Now, the validation failure action there is set to audit, which means that you will, instead of a resource being blocked out of hand, you will be able to see a policy report to know if you have some that are violating this. You're able to go and kind of track down the developers, find out what the apps that are responsible for that, and change those things. So this is just one simple example of how a validate rule can be written to accomplish a security use case. Is there another one on how you might accomplish your own governance use cases. Very often, one of the practices is organizations have their own labels that they want to make sure apply to resources. And these can be any sort of resource, or maybe in some cases, all resources. So once again, Kyverno takes a very elegant approach and a simple approach to policy authoring. And I once again challenge you to see if you can figure out what this does. But as the message may imply there, the label team is required. We want to make sure that every resource, in this case a pod, has a label called team with some value. And we're enforcing this behavior, which means that if a resource, a pod in this case again, does not have that label, it will be blocked and that message returned back. So that's one example of a security use case. This is another example of a governance use case. Both of these are just validate rules. If we had more time, we could dive into this. But as you can see, the policy language is very straightforward. And in only just a few lines, you're able to take action on a variety of resources and do so in a very simplistic manner. Now, that's great when you have a single cluster, but one of the things that we need to be able to ensure in the reality today, which is you're going to have multiple clusters. You typically don't just have one. Gone are sort of the days where Kubernetes was so difficult and cumbersome to set up, where we really avoided having multiple clusters, but now it's everyone almost has a tool internally to do that. So multi-clusters are a reality. So you need a way to get that same governance, that same visibility across your teams in a single portal. Nirmata Policy Manager is an offering that we've created internally that allows you to do this at scale and gives you the benefit of getting these multiple teams inside of a centralized portal, and are able to get not only reports, but also a lot of the benefits from Kyverno. So it's a multi-cluster manager. You attach multiple clusters that have Kyverno installed, and you can roll up these things. I have curated policy sets, so you can bring your own, but we also have a set of policies that we bring, that we've curated, that you can roll out instantly to one or all of your clusters seamlessly. And it gives you an estate view of things like statistics and those policy reports, which is top of mind for security folks. You can even schedule those to know across my entire fleet, how am I doing from a reporting perspective? Am I in compliance? Am I out of compliance? You can do things like get monitoring and metrics information from the execution of those policies. How are these things doing? How long are they taking? This is all built in. RBAC, obviously, everybody has to have RBAC, and Nirmata Policy Manager brings this as well for multiple teams. You can have SAML integration, OIDC, MFA. This allows this cross-team collaboration so that you can have folks that are your cluster operators that can change things, your security teams that can log in and view policy reports, for example, combination thereof. Naturally, with any enterprise tool, you need integrations with other tools. So things like Slack, Jira, Git, these are all built in. So you can connect to these essential enterprise tools and do things like send reports and violations and whatnot to those. Alarms and notifications, and even compliance standards. You want to know if your clusters are not just operating on the policies, but if they're compliant to things like SIS standards. And so let me quickly just flip over and show an example of what this looks like in real life. And this is an example of Nirmata Policy Manager, which I'm showing a dashboard that has a cluster attached with a number of different policies from policy sets deployed. And we can see on the summary that we have a number of policies, a bunch of rules that have been evaluated against those, alarms, and a roll-up of the policy status. So you can see things like violations by category of the policy, which you can write your own. You can put whatever category that you want. For example, I have one called My Org, and you can imagine that this would be any number of maybe different categories that you have within your organization. But it gives you a quick at-a-glance view across your entire estate, not only by cluster, but also by category. How am I doing? So these policy sets are groups of Kyverno policies. We curate some internally that you can deploy, and you can also bring your own, whether that's from an upstream Git repository or whether that's from like a YAML set. Policy reports. We can look at the actual reports that Kyverno is generating in the background to see how well you're doing. And so for things like pod security standards, we can drill in and look at examples of how these resources are behaving or not behaving in our cluster. And compliance. We have a number of compliance standards that you can use to understand how you are in accordance with things like SIS or NIST, and also add your own. And so that's about it I want to cover for Nirmata Policy Manager. And so quickly flipping back over to the slides, I want to inform you of KubeCon Detroit. If you're coming to KubeCon North America, we are delivering several sessions around Kyverno. And we also have a couple of different events. So DevSecOps Meetup is happening on Tuesday. And also I'll be delivering an Intro to Kyverno workshop on that same day. And if you're interested in knowing more about Kyverno, getting hands-on with it, and diving into some more of these things that we didn't cover today, please come and join us for that. And we hope to see you there.
Definitely do. Thanks, Chip. Thanks, Jim. Fantastic talks. We do have some questions teed up. And by the way, hopefully we see folks at KubeCon. I'll be there as well, and meet with all of us that are interested in Kubernetes. We've got some great questions lined up here. Folks have submitted. I think this is a good one to start with. So it says, I'm new to using policy. Which types of policies or their use cases that you would recommend starting with? Who'd like to field that? Is that kind of a you question, Chip, or more Jim?
Yeah, sure. I think the lowest hanging fruit that everyone should be looking for is pod security. Like, pods run containers. It's the atomic unit of scheduling inside of Kubernetes. Everyone should be enforcing some pod security standards. Hopefully you want to look at the pod security standards, which is a codified set of sort of best practices that pertain to security around pods. But even if you aren't able to even achieve one of the lowest profiles, you're doing something in your environment to block some of the most common things that can be used to circumvent protections and that can result in an insecure environment. So if you don't have policy today, one of the first things that you should look at is implementing pod security standards. And that can be through Kyverno. There are other tools, but Kyverno does offer you not only a very simple way to do that, and that'll get simpler in the future, but also, and this is key, allowing you to define exclusions, because this is a reality as well in production environments. You will have to provide some exemptions and some exclusions based upon how you operate, how your business operates, what products are running. And so doing that in a simple and elegant way is a very important thing. So pod security is the first thing that you should get started with.
Absolutely, would totally second that. And then the two others that I would add to the list after you've implemented pod security is, like Chip mentioned, pods are the fundamental unit of deployment, but composing a workload takes a lot of other resources. So workload security, best practices like things like probes, resource quotas, those are extremely important in multi-tenant environments. So one workload does not impact another. And then, more advanced use cases, which we see as becoming fairly critical because of the types of attacks we're starting to see in the Kubernetes space, especially around the software supply chain, is container image signing and verification, right? So being able to sign your containers in your CI/CD pipeline and then verify them at admission controls through policy engines like Kyverno, as well as routinely checking for attestations, which could be vulnerability scan reports, things like that, which have to be kept up to date in your environments itself. Really helps with managing some of these newer, more sophisticated types of threats. So those would be the top three in my, from my perspective.
Great, fantastic. Let's see, our next question we've received here. We're currently using Kubernetes PSPs for pod security. What steps should we take now to prepare for its upcoming removal?
Yeah, one of the things that you should do right now is to sort of take an inventory of how you're using PSPs and where they're in effect, because you will probably want to duplicate something like that. And then the next thing that you want to do, once you kind of understood like what you're expecting to apply and how you're doing that, is to look for something that can kind of take over. Pod security policies are now gone as of 1.25. They're not just deprecated, they're actually removed, which means that if you upgrade, they'll be gone. So a couple things to keep in mind there is that pod security policies can have the ability to change resources. And if you're moving to the new pod security admission capability that's built into Kubernetes, you will lose that ability. But regardless of which approach that you use, if you're going to use the built-in pod security admission controller, which is a great way to get started and enforcing things like the baseline profile, or using Kyverno, you want to start slow rolling that in like a development and test environment to make sure that your expectations are going to be met, that you provide for things like exclusions, that you're aware that if things aren't getting mutated, what effect does that have at the end of the day when resources are trying to get created? So a couple ways that you can get started with that, but making sure that one, you understand it's actually removed and that's a different process from deprecation, and also what the options are for replacement and how those how those work in a test environment.
Great. Jim, anything you want to add? Or are we good?
No, I think that covers it very well. And I will, I'm going to share a link in the chat also to a blog post on this topic for reference.
Fantastic, fantastic. Maybe Cody, if you would pin that up in our chat so folks can find that easily. Let's see, another question we have. Do you think having a DevSecOps lead is necessary to start using policy management effectively?
Yeah, I can try to answer that. So what we're seeing in the community is very interesting, right? So as Kubernetes, like I was mentioning, has started changing some of the organizational structures and processes, it's typically the operations team that's taking the lead and the charter to put in these policies, perhaps initially for some automation, right? Like labeling, automating, fine-grained role-based access control configurations, creating network policies by default, things like that. But as they get comfortable with that, there tends to be growing awareness within these operations teams about the security concerns. And interestingly, they're leading the charter. So we have, several customers we have worked with. The interesting thing is the operations team has ended up leading cloud security, and we've seen some official title changes, some official growth patterns in these organizations where there's a new cloud security team or perhaps a Kubernetes security team that evolves out of this and really takes on that DevSecOps charter and starts, broadening their responsibilities. So I don't think it's necessary to have a lead necessarily to start. It's more about taking that ownership from the ops perspective, the cluster admins being responsible for security concerns, working with InfoSec and central security, then to form these new organizations who are driving that DevSecOps transition.
And I would just add that to follow on what Jim said, security is for everyone. Security is not just for only the large organizations or organizations that have clearly defined structures and roles. Obviously, that's the case a lot of times, but security can be for everyone, and policy should be for everyone if you're operating Kubernetes in production. And one of the things that we've tried hard to do in Kyverno is to make that simple, because when you find that security is simple, people tend to circumvent it less. It tends to work better. People can reason about it. And so those things are goals that everybody should be striving for. No matter what your role is, you can implement security. It can be simple. It doesn't have to cost you months of time in order to understand and implement it. And there are simple ways that you can get started with that we hopefully have tried to outline here.
Excellent. Another question that we had posted was, can you speak to logging, monitoring, and how this would fit into a larger operational pattern? I'm curious about this myself too, when you think about observability tools and tracing, and knowing that some policies may not be compliant might be super useful to triaging something.
Yeah, so something we've seen is, to make policies useful, you have to give the right information at the right time to the right folks, right? So if it's one thing, to say, okay, well, my security team has a dashboard where they have this visibility, but your developers and operators who are actually managing workloads don't have access to that, right? So that, of course, doesn't work. So Kyverno from the very beginning was very focused on embracing technologies like open telemetry and other observability patterns, where through Kubernetes native events, through even the reporting, being a native resource in Kubernetes, is accessible to the workload owners, to the operators who are trying to deploy a pod or a deployment or stateful set. They get that immediate actionable feedback in their namespace, in their resources. So bringing that information, that observability to the right team, and making it available in tools that they're familiar with, and again, leveraging the guts of Kubernetes for that, made a lot of sense to us as we were designing and building Kyverno.
Chip, anything you want to add?
I'll just add that the folks like Jim and others in the policy working group have done really exemplifies this, and that is the ability to really decouple the results that you see from the actual policy intent. And what we've seen with other policy engines is that doesn't happen, and so it makes observability more of a challenge. When you tie observability to things that are inherent into other systems, like, for example, an esoteric system of enforcing policy, and you can only see observability as related to that corner, then it makes observability difficult. That results in blind spots, and you don't really want blind spots in an organization. You want to have a kind of a holistic view, regardless of the technology that you employ. And so one of the things that Kyverno has done by adopting this policy working group format for reports is that decoupling, which then makes observability easier. because you can control who gets to see those reports with existing RBAC tools. It's not a bespoke system. It doesn't pigeonhole things and lump them in with another system that may not be the concern of auditors or security folks. It puts it out in the clear so that anyone and any standard tooling, which is extremely important because you want to leverage the existing investments that you have in those tools, they can make use of that, add that to your existing observability stack, and then you get more comprehensive information in one place.
Fantastic. A couple of questions I wanted to throw into the mix, if that's okay. I'm curious about you're talking about governance and compliance, and we all know software developers love to fill out paperwork, being sarcastic, of course. And I have to believe that there's some tangible benefits to developers and operations team having that data available about compliance already that can be fed into either compliance groups or to security teams. Can you talk a little bit about how that works?
Absolutely. Yeah. So the value, of course, and developers want to deliver systems, want to deliver, their solutions to their customers faster. Now, having things like, guardrails, and there is this, also term that gets used in the cloud native community, creating golden paths, right? So to me, guardrails are fundamental in creating those golden paths for developers to allow them to actually move faster and deliver value faster themselves. So when we talk about, policy and governance, of course, the sort of the old school way of thinking of it is, oh my god, I have to now do all these other things. It's going to take me away from what I really want to deliver and achieve. But the cloud native way of doing policy and governance, it is doing policy as code. It's doing continuous compliance checks. It actually helps speed up the development process because you're catching these errors early as in your CI/CD pipeline. You're getting the recommendation and feedback in native tools, and you're able to have a faster loop. You don't have to wait 3 months where some auditor tells you that, hey, you can't put this code into production because of something you might have missed, and that gets flipped back into your development process, right? So now with these faster feedback cycles very early, and this is where shift left adds a lot of value, it speeds up teams. And one interesting kind of thing, I was just reading one of the latest state of DevOps reports. This was published just a few weeks ago. It actually showed that correlation where teams that had adopted security best practices, emerging standards like SLSA for software supply chain, there was a strong correlation with them being able to deliver faster and being the top performers.
Interesting. I'm curious too, if you come from kind of a network security or traditional security role, you're used to kind of the vulnerability reports or SOC incidents being channeled maybe through tickets and et cetera to other parts of the organization to development to make changes. We live in a world of declarative environments. You were talking about both Jim and Chip. That has to change sort of the remediation cycle, right? Being not only faster, but since you're making declarative changes, and you may be writing code, you may be changing code as well. But I would think fitting that into a DevOps process with automation, with automated testing, with flow potentially into production, if not done manually, has got to kind of change the thinking about how do we fix these things and how long they're going to exist when things are out of compliance. I'd appreciate your thoughts on that.
Yeah, so lots of interesting work again in that space with vulnerability management, because we all know static analysis and analyzing artifacts for vulnerability, that's important, right? That's not going away. That needs to happen. It needs to happen, in fact, in an automated and continuous manner at every phase of your delivery and your CI/CD cycle. The question then becomes, how do we optimize again these for that agility, but with the autonomy and alignment across teams, across your infosec and your development teams, etc. So this is where as I was mentioning earlier, Kubernetes and cloud native are changing these fundamental processes. We're seeing even vulnerability management now evolve to be able to perform these type of scans early in your CI/CD cycles, create attestations from these vulnerability reports, push them into OCI registries, which policies can then check at every phase of your delivery pipeline, in your dev test, in your staging, in your production environments. So that creates a very powerful automated kind of a set of feedback loops to modernize these processes, which otherwise would take literally paperwork or external tools or other things to get a vulnerability exception approved. There are emerging standards like WEX, which are being developed also to help translate this to automated formats, which can then again be used for policy checks in your delivery pipelines across the cloud native ecosystem.
Great, thanks. But one important last question: where can folks find out more, either downloading open source, finding out more about commercial offerings from Nirmata?
So nirmata.com is our website, and there's a lot of good information, blog posts on Kyverno as well as Nirmata tools and technologies. Kyverno.io is also available, and of course we're fairly active on the social channels like Twitter and others, as well as in the Kubernetes and CNCF Slack forums. So feel free to reach out on any of those.
Fantastic. Well, before I hand it back over to Cody, we have some gift cards to hand out. Anything else, Cody or Jim? Parting thoughts before we do that? Everybody good?
Yeah, no, so I'm certainly very excited in terms of this discussion and presentation. And, the survey results were also extremely interesting. So those are things we'll be taking back both internally as well as to the community. And we're always looking for how to, kind of further improve and extend. So would love to hear more feedback.
Excellent. There were some confirmations as well as some new information too. That's always helpful. Both, right?
Absolutely.
Know you're headed in a good direction and where you might expand or course correct. Excellent. Well, thank you both. Cody, I hand it back to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Mitch and Chip, Jim. Thank you both so much for joining us today. I really appreciate all the work that goes into the demos and the slideshows as well. So thank you so much. I would love to remind our audience that this session was recorded. So following this program, you will receive an email with a link to access that recording on demand, or you can find that recording living on the DevOps website at devops.com/webinars. So Mitch did mention we do have 4 $25 Amazon gift cards to give out. So our winners are Srini R., Brittany H., Robert B., and Andre P. So to our 4 winners, congratulations. Keep an eye on your email inbox to claim that gift card. But if you don't happen to see that email, check your spam folder. And I'd also like to big shout out to Nirmata for sponsoring today's program. Jim, Mitch, Chip, thank you all again. And to our audience, thank you so much for joining. We do really appreciate you spending time with us. And we do want to ask for just one more moment, as we will put a survey up on your screen here in just a second as soon as we close out. We really want you to respond to that survey, as that really helps us to make these programs better for you going forward. So with nothing else going forward, everyone have a great rest of your day.